It started like every other charity gala in Hollywood. Velvet ropes, flashing lights, and too many publicists pretending not to look nervous. Inside, the ballroom was over-decorated and under-sincere. Studio executives rubbed elbows with influencers. Former athletes laughed loudly near people they barely knew. Everyone pretended to be relaxed, but nobody truly was. That was the unspoken truth about events like this. Tom Cruise arrived alone. He always did. No bodyguards. No entourage. Just the quiet, controlled presence of a man who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything. He moved through the room like someone who knew exactly where he was going, even if no one else did. He smiled when spoken to. He paused for photographs when asked, but his eyes scanned the room with an alertness that didn't match the rest of his calm. At the far end of the ballroom, Dax Hunter was already holding court. He was a recent breakout in the MMA world, undefeated, loud, young, and unmistakably aware of both. Dax had been invited by a supplement company sponsoring the event, and from the moment he walked in, he acted like the whole place had been built for him. He was the kind of man who laughed too loud and too fast. The kind who spoke just a few decibels above appropriate. He wore a suit that was slightly too tight across the chest, and he kept flexing his jaw like he wanted someone to ask him what weight class he fought in. Nobody did. That didn't stop him. "Yo," Dax said suddenly, pointing across the room. "That Cruise." The PR girl beside him nodded without much interest. Dax grinned. Didn't realize he was that small in real life. It wasn't loud enough to draw attention, but it was loud enough to be intentional. The people near him didn't laugh. They gave polite half-smiles and turned their eyes away. The joke wasn't funny. More than that, it felt out of place. And that's why Dax kept going. Later in the evening, when the award presentations began, Tom took the stage to deliver a tribute speech to a veteran stunt coordinator. His voice was steady. His words were thoughtful. He spoke about teamwork, about respect for those who worked behind the camera. It wasn't a performance. It didn't need to be. Tom wasn't trying to impress anyone. He spoke like a man who had learned the cost of control and chose to keep paying it. From the third table back, Dax leaned toward his date and whispered something with a grin. She didn't respond. She just looked down at her hands. The moment Tom finished his speech and stepped down from the stage, Dax stood up without invitation. He crossed the room too quickly for anyone to stop him. Tom had just returned to his table when Dax appeared, blocking the path between the chair and the tablecloth. "Cruise," Dax said with the grin still stretched across his face. "Wanted to say what's up." Tom looked up. He didn't smile, but he didn't flinch either. "Good evening," he said simply. Dax leaned closer. "You ever think about stepping into the octagon?" he asked, loud enough that several tables turned to look. Tom didn't respond immediately. He set his hands calmly on the back of his chair. Then he looked at Dax with the kind of gaze that didn't rise to meet a challenge. It waited for one to fall apart. "No," Tom said. "I haven't." Dax raised his eyebrows, mock surprised. "Come on, man. You do your own stunts, right? Thought maybe you'd want to test that on someone real." Tom stayed quiet for a moment. The smile never returned. The calm never left. "I test myself enough," he said. That was not the answer Dax wanted. "You scared?" The word dropped between them like bait. Tom didn't bite. He didn't shift his stance. He didn't raise his voice. He just tilted his head slightly to the side. "This is a charity event," he said. "I don't believe in showing off for cameras when people are here for something real." Dax smiled wider, but the corners of his eyes had tightened. "Not showing off," he said. "Just figured the action hero might want a little action." Tom's response was so soft it barely reached the next table, but somehow, everyone heard it. "I've trained with men who never needed to raise their voices to be dangerous." There was no malice in his voice, just truth. For the first time, Dax blinked. "You train?" he asked. Tom didn't answer the question directly. "I've studied martial arts for over 30 years, he said. "Not for applause. Not for validation. For discipline. For clarity." Dax laughed, but it was thinner now. "Karate, among others." Dax opened his mouth again, but nothing clever came out. Tom didn't press the silence. He let it exist. Someone nearby touched Dax's arm lightly. "Let's get back to our seats," she said. Dax didn't move. For half a second, it looked like he might say something else. But the words never formed. Tom hadn't threatened him. He hadn't raised a hand. But in that moment, Dax Hunter, the undefeated, unapologetic, attention-seeking fighter, realized he was standing in front of a man who didn't care about his record. Tom pulled out his chair and sat down. Not fast, not defiant, just still. Dax stepped back. "Respect," he muttered. It wasn't clear if he meant it, but he said it anyway. Then he turned and walked away, slower this time. The crowd that had been watching silently now turned back to their wine glasses, pretending not to have seen anything. But they had seen. They had all seen. And what they saw wasn't a confrontation. It was a revelation. Because Tom Cruise hadn't raised a fist. He hadn't raised his voice. But he had revealed something that Dax never expected to find here. An opponent he couldn't provoke. A man who didn't need to prove who he was. Because Tom already knew. And now, so did everyone else. _Thunderthor. The story could have ended there. Dax Hunter could have returned to his table. He could have laughed it off with a drink and let the moment fade. But people like Dax didn't know how to walk away from silence. Not when the silence said more than their words ever could. And not when the eyes in the room had shifted from curiosity to something colder. Something closer to judgment. For the rest of the night, Dax watched Tom from across the ballroom. He watched him speak to veterans. He watched him take photos with donors. He watched how no one hovered near Tom Cruise, but everyone gravitated toward him. Not out of celebrity, out of calm. Dax couldn't understand it. He had built his entire identity on presence, on size, on being the loudest man in the room. He was used to admiration, or at least fear. But Tom had offered him neither. And Dax had felt something far worse. He had felt dismissed. The next morning, the video surfaced. A leaked clip. Low quality. Captured from a shaky phone at table 12. But the audio was clear. Dax's words. His smirk. The moment he said, "You scared?" And Tom's voice in return. Calm. Controlled. "I've trained with men who never needed to raise their voices to be dangerous." The clip spread fast. Too fast. Within hours, it was being reposted across fight forums, fan accounts, and entertainment blogs. But it wasn't Dax they were talking about. It was Tom. Tom Cruise handled that better than most trained fighters would have. That wasn't a flex. That was discipline. He didn't need to prove anything. That's what made it powerful. Dax read the comments. He read all of them. And something inside him twisted. The next few days passed in awkward silence. His management team told him to lay low, not to engage. But Dax wasn't built for silence. Silence had already beaten him once. So when a podcast reached out with an offer, an exclusive chance to set the record straight, Dax said yes before they finished the sentence. He walked into the studio with a chip on his shoulder and a carefully rehearsed grin. "Look," he said into the mic, "I got mad respect for Tom Cruise. Seriously. Legend. I was just messing around that night. It was a joke. Didn't expect people to get so emotional about it." The hosts nodded. They laughed too hard at every line. And then Dax added something that wasn't in the notes. "But real talk? If he ever wanted to actually train, I'd be down. Could show him a few things. I mean, stunts are one thing. Combat's another." It was a throwaway comment. But it wasn't forgotten. Especially not by the people who had trained with Tom. The clip reached Hiro Tanaka 2 days later. Hiro was one of the most respected instructors in traditional karate. Soft-spoken. Humble. A man who had spent more time in practice halls than in front of cameras. He had trained with Cruise for over a decade. And when he saw Dax's interview, he didn't get angry. He just made a call. The call was short. Tom picked up on the second ring. "Are you aware of what he said?" Hiro asked. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he answered, "I am. Would you like to respond?" Another pause. Tom's voice stayed steady. "No. But I'll train." 3 days later, a studio lot in Burbank was cleared for a private session. No cameras. No press. Just mats, water, and silence. Tom arrived early. He always did. He warmed up slowly, deliberately. His movements weren't flashy. They were precise, balanced. He had practiced the same forms for years, not because he needed to look good on film, but because they reminded him of something Hollywood could never give him: control. Dax arrived late. He came in laughing, with a duffel bag over his shoulder and a GoPro strapped to his chest. "You mind if I record this?" he asked, already halfway through the door. Tom didn't answer. He just kept stretching. Hero stepped forward. "No cameras," he said firmly. Dax shrugged. "Whatever." He set the bag down. He looked around. "So what's the plan? Spar a little? Trade some techniques?" Tom stood up. He bowed to Hero. Then he turned to Dax. "If you want to train, we'll train." Dax grinned. But what followed was not what he expected. There were no punches. No kicks. Not at first. Tom began with basic forms. Repetitions. Breathing. Footwork. Dax copied the movements with exaggerated energy, making faces, cracking jokes. But Tom didn't respond. He just kept moving. Each step was deliberate. Each strike controlled. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. By the time they reached partner drills, Dax's smirk had faded. Tom didn't speak. He didn't taunt. He just moved with a focus that felt unshakable. Every parry landed with precision. Every counterstrike arrived just close enough to make Dax feel it, but never close enough to make contact. It was teaching, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like something else. Eventually, Hero called for a break. Tom walked to the side, picked up his towel. Dax sat on the mat, breathing harder than he wanted to admit. He looked at Tom. "You really train like this all the time?" Tom nodded. Dax didn't speak for a while. When he finally did, the words came out slower. "I thought this was going to be something else." Tom looked over. "What did you think it was going to be?" Dax swallowed. "I don't know. A flex. A show. A chance to prove something." Tom's voice didn't change. "There's nothing to prove when you already know who you are." And just like that, Dax understood what had been bothering him since the night of the gala. It wasn't that Tom hadn't fought back. It was that Tom had never needed to. Underscore. Dax didn't talk much after the session ended. The mats were rolled back. The lights turned off one by one. Tom stayed behind, speaking with Hero in hushed tones about something unrelated. Likely scheduling, maybe technique, but nothing about Dax. Because Tom had already moved on. Dax noticed that, and it stayed with him. The next morning, he posted nothing. No Instagram story. No post-training selfie. The GoPro footage remained untouched in his bag. Not because he forgot, but because for the first time in a long time, he didn't want anyone to see what had happened. Not because he had been embarrassed. He hadn't. Not exactly. He hadn't been beaten. He hadn't been humiliated. But he had been exposed. Not by Tom. By himself. The days that followed felt different. Louder. He showed up at the gym, and everything felt just a little more performative. His own jokes sounded thinner. His own stories felt rehearsed. The laughs he used to enjoy now sounded forced. Not from others. From himself. He found himself thinking about Tom's movements. The precision. The calm. The refusal to escalate. He thought about the way Tom never once spoke about himself in grand terms. How he never mentioned belts, ranks, or accolades. Not even once. He just trained and left, like it meant something to him that didn't require an audience. That bothered Dax more than he expected. One night, Dax called his coach. Not the publicist. Not the agent. His old coach. The one who trained him when he was still broke, when nobody knew his name. "I want to change up my routine," Dax said. "Why?" the coach asked. Dax hesitated. "I want to go back to basics." There was a pause on the line. Then the coach gave a small laugh. "You finally get tired of hearing your own hype?" Dax didn't respond. He didn't need to. 2 weeks later, the internet did what it always does. It moved on. The clip from the gala faded from the feed. New gossip, new fights, new faces. But not everyone forgot. One outlet ran a follow-up headline. "Tom Cruise ends fight, without a fight, leaves MMA stars speechless. The article was short. It recapped the leaked video. It quoted a few experts on martial arts etiquette. A retired sensei said, "The highest form of mastery is restraint. If someone can provoke you but not move you, they're not in control. You are." Under the article was a single comment that gained quiet traction. It read, "Strength that never has to speak is the kind people don't know how to challenge. Because it doesn't speak to them. It speaks through them." Dax read that comment 5 times. Then he screenshotted it. He didn't post it anywhere. He printed it, taped it inside his locker, and never mentioned it again. Months passed, then nearly a year. Tom Cruise never referenced the incident publicly. He didn't need to. He went back to shooting, back to the things that had always mattered to him. But those who had been in the room that night, the ones who felt the quiet shift in energy, never quite forgot it. Because it wasn't just that Tom Cruise had handled the confrontation with grace. It was that he had revealed a truth that every loud man fears. That not being afraid of conflict doesn't make you strong. Being unbothered by it does. Dax would go on to win 2 more fights that year. But they looked different now. The entrances were quieter. The post-match interviews less rehearsed. He still smiled. Still flexed. But there was something smaller behind his eyes. Something more measured. The fans called it maturity. The critics called it evolution. But those who knew the real story just called it what it was. A man learning that silence isn't weakness. It's power. Especially when it stands in the face of noise and doesn't flinch.